Hi. Thank you to everyone for coming, and above all to the organizers. As Nicholas says, I'm going to try to present this book, but in Jan's honor, I'm going to start with an anecdote with which the book actually begins. It concerns this woman, a dissident named Zdena Tominova, who was the spokesperson of Charter 77, which was a dissident group in then Czechoslovakia that gained international fame and was part of a coalition internationally that made transnational human rights activism, which was new at the time, something very visible in the world. She was expelled from her country. First, she took a visit to the West, and then the communist government in Czechoslovakia made her visit permanent, and she went into exile. And she gave a talk about human rights in 1980 in Dublin. And interestingly, she began by defending human rights activism, but also her home country's policies in the economic domain. She said she had been young at the time of the Czech coup, as we call it, and witnessed as a child the leveling of classes that occurred actually in many of the welfare states in the middle of the 20th century, but with great speed when communists came to power in Eastern Europe. And she remembered that she gained a sense of social justice that even in the age of human rights that she was helping begin, she didn't want to relinquish. It wasn't that socialism, which she had experienced firsthand, should just provide an alibi, as it did for communist governments, for abandoning human rights and violating them at every turn. She insisted on that much. But she also made the reverse argument that no more could an embrace of human rights like free speech, freedom of the press, bodily integrity from torture, and so forth, none of those values could serve as a reason to abandon the quest for economic equality, including in a socialist tradition. Well, she was disappointed. This is a so-called engram. Google reads all the books in all the languages and allows us to see how words, phrases, and so forth fare comparatively over time in the universe of language. Sadly, it allows looking into English and a series of other global languages, but not Nordic ones. So I think you should take a complaint on behalf of Danish to Google. And yet in all the languages we can test so far, we find these results. Socialism as a concept and word is so popular that it far outstrips the notion of human rights, however it's said in the relevant language. And yet, at just the time Tominova spoke, human rights are going to have an enormous increase right there in around 1975. And at that same moment, socialism is beginning its world historical collapse. It's as if the two changed places. Exactly, in a sense, the opposite of what Tominova wanted, which was to embrace the two together, human rights alongside fundamental economic fairness. And of course, the two lines cross in 1989 at the end of the Cold War and at the end of the socialist state, at least outside China. And as we'll see, China is going to play a major role in our own neoliberal era. The question I think we should ask in light of this old dissident's hope is, why did it fail? Did it have to be that way? is there any way, as she hoped, to connect the most basic civil liberties and maybe essential economic and social rights too, with the broadest kind of economic fairness, which among whatever else it involves, you might think, involves some constraints on material inequality. As of today, our answer has to be in the negative. We've lived in a period where these two things have not connected. And so we have to ask, is that our destiny? Do we have to choose one of the two things Tominova hoped to connect, or could we combine them? I'll leave that question for the end. So as Nicholas has argued in his introduction, this book is intended to take a different view of some matters that have been much discussed in the last decade. As historians who'd really not asked the question before have emerged in a herd or a stampede to try to figure out, where did human rights come from? And yet I want to convince you that they haven't posed this very basic question about how that problem connects to distribution and economics, although I think it ought to be one of our most pressing questions. As Nicholas said, much of the literature focused on the emergence of the idea that individuals have rights in virtue of their humanity, which probably goes back to the Middle Ages for all I know, or at least to the 17th century. And then very popularly, they focused on how human rights became politically explosive at the end of the 18th century in events like the American and French revolutions. Nicholas is right that until about 7 or 8 years ago, the most popular era to focus on was the 1940s. And that's because it was then that the United Nations was founded and eventually propounded a Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Now, what's interesting is that the literature on these eras didn't really address even economic and social rights, which were part of the story of rights in all of those eras, or the much broader question of the economics of the moment in which a breakthrough is thought to have occurred. Just as an example, consider the 1940s. We know that this is the moment of the apogee of a certain consensus around national welfare, at least in the North Atlantic. It would seem that one's account of the Universal Declaration, or the moment after World War II, thinking about the Declaration's place, would address distribution and economics, yet no historian really has done so. Now, as Nicholas also mentioned, I've tried to make a mark by arguing, even before engrams were available to us, that historians had always been looking at the wrong time for human rights. And now we can see that there's some justification for that suspicion. A great Danish historian out there in the audience has claimed that the 60s are the time that really mattered, not the 1940s. If so, this chart doesn't suggest anything really big happened then. But it does suggest that the wave of human rights discourse broke through in the 1970s. And various arguments have been mounted for why that was, or what happened at that moment. And yet, those who have been in that debate, notably including myself, have not addressed distribution and economics. What was it about the economic situation of the 1970s when this inflection point occurs, or of our time more generally, which many now call neoliberal, that have made human rights so favored, not just as a way of talking, but as a way of organizing our moral outlook, telling us what to care about and how to pursue it. And so it's in the spirit of correcting this omission in the literature and in my own work that I want to give this lecture today, which is really about how to think about the economics of human rights. Now, the moment one asks that question, one has to engage or re-engage with the great thinker on this topic. Of course, I'm referring to Karl Marx, who in his youth wrote a classical essay entitled On the Jewish Question that took up the economics of rights. What he claimed is that in the French Revolution, he gives a detailed analysis, among other texts, of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789. Rights are condemned to be a universalism that serves narrowly or particularly bourgeois interests. And for that reason, they will have to be abandoned if human emancipation, as he calls it, rather than political emancipation, is to be achieved. Now, I want to single out a few aspects of his approach, because I think we have to face them head on if we want to think about human rights from the perspective of distribution and economics. Maybe the first, and I'm going to argue most powerful, claim that Marx makes is that political economy, Marxists sometimes call it the base, exerts some kind of determination on our ideas and indeed our lifestyles and everything else about the societies organized around a particular mode of production or political economy, as Marx and others called it. Now, in his time, when he looked out at what he called capitalism, he claimed that this determination of human rights by bourgeois interests and rule meant that human rights were inflexible. Human rights could only serve the political emancipation of the bourgeoisie, and they were unsalvageable. For the sake of the working class and for more broadly human emancipation, human rights would have to be abandoned. So these were Marx's claims, and I want to confront them and see if they're true by looking at three historical stages. First, Marx's own, the stage of 19th century political economy. Then, second, that fascinating mid-20th century moment of the creation or expansion of the national welfare states in the North Atlantic before some tried to take them global. Finally, the third stage, our time, of welfare retrenchment and so-called neoliberal globalization. What is the relation, we have to ask at each stage, between human rights and political economy? And in particular, is Marx right that human rights are bound to the way that things are produced, exchanged, and distributed? And is he right that for this reason human rights are inflexible and unsalvageable? Now, to make my argument, I have to make one last preliminary point about two different moral ideals about distribution in particular that you might adopt. Distribution concerns who gets what. And you might believe that what matters morally is so-called sufficient provision, that what matters exclusively or first is that individuals get enough of the basic decencies of life, whatever those are, a job, housing, food, sanitation, water. You might just add all these up and monetize them, and you might be a proponent of a universal basic income, a line of distributional minimum But if you're a rights thinker, you say you can't add them up, you can't monetize them, because it doesn't matter if you have money, it matters if you get water and a certain amount. And no matter how much water you have, it doesn't matter if you don't have a house alongside it. And so economic and social rights, as generally conceived, mostly are sufficient provision norms. They say everyone is entitled to a certain amount. They tell us more or less how much the worst off should get, what they have as a minimum entitlements. They do not tell us how, whether the rich ought to pay for those things, or whether in general the rich ought to be able to get as rich as they can. Now, some people from the French Revolution to the present have adopted the idea that sufficiency is all that matters. The first person I found is Thomas Paine, who did a lot to popularize the idea of human rights, actually. In one of his books, he says, it doesn't matter how rich the rich are if the poor get what they need. And today, there are many heirs of Thomas Paine. They're called sufficientarians in English. Probably the best known is this old Princeton philosopher named Harry Frankfurt, who became famous when an essay of his called On Bullshit was republished as a Christmas gift. He has another old essay called On Inequality, which you can buy to stuff stockings. And its argument is that it doesn't matter how rich the rich are, as long as the poor are gotten out of poverty. And yet there's this other moral ideal which has been powerful, at least until our time, and it's equality. Even if the poor are taken out, we shouldn't have hierarchy economically, and we should live in one society rather than more than one. And that view, although there are a lot of differences in justification and form of the argument, we can call egalitarianism. And I want to suggest that this distinction will help us as we now think through my story of 3 stages. So let's start with the first stage. Well, I'll just be brief about this. Marx either was able to see something true about the 19th century, or he came by his illusions about rights honestly, because the most vigorously defended rights of the 19th century when he lived were indeed the right to freedom of contract and the sanctity of private property. And so it was reasonable, perhaps, or more reasonable for him to look at his world and see little more in rights politics than a mystification of the interests of those who already had enough. And in fairness, he also was witness to a moment in political economy that saw the abuse of both of the moral ideals I've mentioned, sufficiency and equality. As we know, the workers' movement in this era burgeoned because capitalism, so-called, created so much widespread misery. And the 19th century was the great era of the production of class inequality, which arose into the 20th century. And so it's only fair to say that whether he turned out to be wrong after his death, Marx was onto something very powerful. It does seem that in the way that rights figured in politics, especially in law and before judges, rights were often enforced as the rights of those who already had interests to protect from those, especially workers, who wanted to claim them. It's true that in the 19th century, some early movements claimed economic and social rights, and we can talk about the details of that story, but they're not canonical anywhere yet. No constitution, for example, in the 19th century features economic and social rights, although there are selected examples as far back as the Jacobin Constitution and the French Revolution of 1793 of economic and social rights. In the second stage, I want to argue this picture changes. Long after Marx's death, through the creation of a series of modular national welfare states, notably in the Nordic countries, though not exclusively, you have a new commitment for the national social body with lots of exclusions, centered on the white male working class and the white portion of it in places like mine where there's significant diversity, not as much in the Nordic countries. You find that the distributional picture in political economy changes. For one thing, the state is much more involved than it had been in the 19th century. In most countries, it plays the role of sponsoring bargains between capital and labor. But even in Eastern Europe eventually, where you basically get welfare states, although in that case under command economies, you get states that are trying to create a different political economic picture. These are always boundaried communities. There are always exclusions without, in admission, but also within, fundamentally in the gendering of all welfare states and also their racialization. And yet, enormous strides relative to the 19th century picture are made in the name of and in the direction of sufficient provision and distributional equality. It's as if our ancestors in the middle of the 20th century adopted both of those distributional ideals. They said both were important and both were important to pursue. And whatever economic equality we have that remains in developed states exists because of the work of those ancestors roughly between the 1930s and the 1950s. Now, what's the significance of this moment, you might ask, for rights? Because that's the burning question to decide whether Marx was correct or not. Well, the broadest phenomenon which we can attest according to the evidence is that rights get marginalized as a language of politics generally. And you can see why. If you're facing a class of wealthy and powerful people who have successfully used rights for a century to protect their interests, you might conclude that Marx was right, even if you're a liberal. And I've just given an example of one such basically liberal thinker, famous in his day, who says everyone's abandoning rights, even in a place like England or the United States, where the same thing occurred. It's as if other languages, other ideals, usually more collective ones and more statist ones, which empower the state, are the dominant ideals of the time. And where socialism ascends, this is the moment when it ascends and socialism becomes a popular ideology, not as a call for world revolution, but as you might say, as a slogan for welfarism in one country. And yet, this moment does see the crystallization, at least at the constitutional level and in some other places, of an expansion of the list of rights. So this same period in which rights are marginalized seems to prove against Marx that rights have at least some degree of flexibility. And perhaps they're also salvageable in a way that Marx didn't anticipate. Because many workers' movements and socialist parties, even if they adopted other rhetoric, worked hard for and in the name of social rights. Now, we shouldn't take this argument too far. There are whole countries where it seems as if the rhetoric goes nowhere. Take the British case, where between 1945 and the end of that decade, the British Labour Party sponsors a major set of renovations, including lots of new mechanisms of fairness like the National Health Service, to take one. We can't tell that any of these went along with or were justified in terms of the idea of rights in general, or claims on provision as social rights or economic rights in particular. And yet, it seems as if we must acknowledge that there's some flexibility and salvageability in rights that Marx maybe didn't perceive. His larger point, though, may stand. If we're interested in what rights means in the 19th century, it turns out we have to know what the political economy is like first. Same thing is true in this mid-20th century era. It's as if first political economy is fought out, and then rights conform to whatever it's like. I won't have enough time to really pursue this, but I think there's lots of evidence that that the welfare state was an era in which both of these distributional ideals I've mentioned were pursued. And just to take an excellent British example, who probably was in English the chief user, or certainly the most famous user of the concept of social rights in this era, even though his state wasn't signing on and labor movements weren't following suit. I'm referring to T.H. Marshall, who was a great theorist of so-called social citizenship. He was a sociologist who gave some famous lectures at the very end of that transformative period of the British Labour Party's work. And what he says about social rights is very interesting, because he says that they capture one part of the welfare state's ideals, that dream of sufficient provision, but it's as if by necessity, sufficient provision can't be separated from egalitarian outcomes. He uses a metaphor. He says, we're not just building a floor of protection against the worst kinds of destitution. That's not what the welfare state is about, or not just that. Because what happens when you raise the floor is that you, of necessity, build the whole building, and by implication, place a ceiling that constrains inequality. I think he thought the two projects were causally related, that you couldn't build a floor without building the whole building, or what would the point be? Maybe in economic terms, he thought, if you're providing basic provision, the wealthy will have to pay for it. And therefore, you place a ceiling on how wealthy they get to be. And so he also had, let's say, an illusion he came by honestly, because in his time, and not just in England, we see the major contraction in material inequality that we've yet seen in modern circumstances of abundance. Now, before moving on from this all-important second stage, I'm led to reconsider what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was. We live, of course, in an age of great international and transnational human rights activism. That's what many of us think human rights are naturally about. And so, interestingly, when all of those historians set out to understand the 40s, and this document in particular, they looked at that moment as an episode when people first tried to internationalize rights, and thought that this document was the banner for the internationalization of rights. And they either got very enthusiastic that it occurred, or they showed, as I tried to do, that the Universal Declaration made little difference, was little noticed, that no internationalization of rights really occurred. I now think everyone was wrong. That what we should really think is that the Universal Declaration was just a template for all of the national welfare experiments that were occurring in its time. It didn't portend, even at the United Nations, let alone generally, a politics of protecting the rights of non-citizens, but it provided a template for what social citizenship was going to be like in the 20th century. And so if that's true, I think we have to see that in its time, it was really connected to an egalitarian project. It doesn't mention economic equality anywhere. It's just a list in its economic and social rights of sufficient provision norms. And yet in real time, it's bound up with a political economy of economic equality at the national stage. Well, I've talked a bit, so let's just note that this moment was restricted chiefly to the North Atlantic. The fascinating thing about decolonization, so-called, is that we can interpret it fundamentally as an attempt to globalize the national welfare state, not as an attempt to have a global human rights movement, but a global welfare state movement. And the new states that were created on the ruins of empires, I think did something even more impressive, which was to view the world as a whole as a space of fair distribution. It's true, for example, as certain people argue, that the new states of the post-war era worked hard at the United Nations to create various treaties, including the new treaty of 1966 that protects economic rights. But in the United Nations, the main goal of these new countries was to create a global welfare structure. This culminated in the 1970s, as I try to show at some length in the book, in the once famous New International Economic Order proposals, which, as you see, were fundamentally a claim not to spread sufficient provision worldwide, to make it an obligation on the part of wealthy, white northern citizens like us to provide a global floor, or to battle against global poverty as we now do as good people. Instead, it was a demand to raise the project of welfare governance for the sake of equality to the worldwide stage. But as we know, that didn't happen. Instead, we got neoliberalism. So now we have to turn to the hard question, the third stage, how we think about the political economy of our time in relation to human rights. Now, I just want to acknowledge this great Marxist international lawyer named Susan Marx, so she comes by her own name honestly, in a review of my first book, for forcing me to think, and hopefully to think with you, about how we deal with the fact that the age of human rights, precisely if you agree that it started in the 1970s, fits with the political economy of our time, which is not welfare governance, let alone global welfare governance, but instead neoliberal globalization, especially after 1989. She says, I think rightly, that the last utopia, that's a reference to an old book of mine, wasn't human rights, it was neoliberalism. And indeed, that was the successful cosmopolitanism of our time. So we're forced to ask, how can we connect? Do we have to connect human rights that we might embrace to this other project, seemingly about something else? True, they coincide in time, and that makes the question necessary. But I want to suggest that the question is difficult, too, especially if you agree that human rights already in the welfare era have proved to be flexible and potentially salvageable. Well, she doesn't mention it, but just so you know, I'm sure you do, our time in many national states, and Denmark is one of them, although less, and it started out with an extraordinary amount of material equality. Our time has been one of the explosion of economic inequality in many countries. These are Thomas Piketty's famous charts on the Anglophone countries where the phenomenon is most exacerbated. What they show is how far the top 1% has reclaimed its massive share of income, of gross domestic product in our time. In the welfare era, inequality is constrained relative to before, and then it explodes again in our time. So that has to be part of the picture, and for me, as you'll see, it's going to be quite central. So I want to make 4 preliminary observations about what makes this problem difficult, because it's not as if we can simply say that human rights returned to the 19th century picture, making it easy for us to say Marx was proved correct in not just his time, but now ours again. So consider a few separate facts. So for one thing, largely in response to those post-colonial countries and projects I mentioned before, international economic law was invented to protect the rights of the wealthy and powerful. But it's just not true that rights generally, or when we think of human rights, the idea reverted to the narrow understanding of the protection of contract and property. Most of us, most people in the world, if polled and asked what human rights are about, they would be likelier, I think we would all acknowledge, at least to say that human rights are a reformist project about improving world governance, protecting the most basic values, which, if they include contract and property, include lots of other things which are more important, like freedom to speak and maybe other things. We should also credit our time with immense gains in status equality, which intersected with the human rights revolution. So I mentioned that the welfare states were always exclusionary, always by gender, and in places unlike this one that had racial diversity, by race as well. In my country, just to take an example, there were lots of new programs, but they were for white males, whereas the black males and blacks in general were excluded from welfare provision in the so-called New Deal in my country. It's not that that's been corrected, and yet we know there have been major anti-discrimination campaigns, which are now often the main substance of human rights at the regional and international levels too. So we might say there's been a big push in the neoliberal era for status equality, even as distributional equality in national settings has suffered. And it just doesn't seem like that occurred in Marx's time either, that we had to acknowledge the huge gains, whether in general or in connection with the idea of rights in the domain of status equality. Finally, we should acknowledge that rights did get connected to big new campaigns, judicialized local campaigns and activist global campaigns for the sake of economic and social rights. Now, this was surprising. When human rights activism first emerged so famously in the 1970s, all the groups like Amnesty International most prominently, or Charter 77 for that matter, it's as if they forgot about the second half of the Universal Declaration that they made famous. They went to war against states and learned new techniques of naming and shaming, but not for violations of distributional sufficiency, rather only for free speech and false imprisonment, torture, eventually death penalty. And yet, we have to acknowledge that especially after 1989, there has been a major push to at least rhetorically honor economic and social rights. It would just not be fair anymore to say that global human rights law or mobilization neglects economic and social rights. And this is quite important because it really does distinguish it from Karl Marx's time, when you just do have a very widespread push for economic and social rights, at least interpreted as a very basic kind of sufficient provision. It's still very important, though, and I want to argue is most revealing, that human rights law and movements do not talk about material inequality, have not made it a significant theme with some very rare and recent exceptions. So I think these observations are going to help us to try to fit human rights in our so-called neoliberal time. So the way I want to do so, very briefly, is in an ecological way. I want to agree with Karl Marx that political economy, the way that production, exchange, and distribution are organized in a society, determines or at least has a massive impact on everything else, including what reform ideas we decide to undertake. That seems undeniable. And it does seem that human rights mean something different now than they did in either of the prior two ages. First of all, they're massively internationalized, but they're also changed in their content to include economic and social rights, including before judges and in movements. And yet, they seem to fit or get along with our neoliberal era in the following way. Human rights movements, even when they intersect distributional politics, seem to be about building that floor of protection. But neoliberalism, however else you might define it, is not working at that level. It's trying to destroy the previously institutionalized ceiling on inequality. And you can then see why these two things can coexist in what child psychologists called parallel play. Two things that are two children that are playing alongside each other, but not cooperating. One building a floor at best, the other destroying a ceiling. Something Marshall did not think was possible, couldn't imagine. Now, in asserting this, I'm trying to stake out a different position than some Marxist thinkers who want to go beyond the claim that political economy matters and stick with the commitments that I told you Marx had to inflexibility and unsalvageability. I don't think their claims are very persuasive, just to be brief. Especially when they claim that human rights have causally abetted or helped or made possible neoliberal ascendancy. That seems the height of implausibility to me. For one thing, it mistakes a very little phenomenon, which human rights activism and law still are, even in a country where you have a human rights institute that's in the news sometimes. That's still little. Whereas neoliberalism is a huge phenomenon that has massively transformed everyone's lives. And the idea that neoliberalism needed help from a human rights revolution to succeed seems just not plausible. So I would rather say that human rights have been affected by this neoliberal era, mainly because they began to seem so important even as we allowed our egalitarian ideals and movements to die. It's more about how we became neoliberals who chose human rights, which are a selected part of morality, while leaving any commitment to material equality behind to live ourselves in a neoliberal era. Now, to make this claim in the least bit persuasive, I'd have to take too much more of your time because we're dealing with a 40 to 50 year phenomenon now, and we're dealing with lots of places that are differently situated across that time span. Consider that the first known laboratory for neoliberal policy is Chile in 1973. But that's very different from my country or the United Kingdom in 1979 or 80, which is in turn very different from Eastern Europe, say the Czech lands, Czechoslovakia, and now the Czech Republic after 1989. Latin America is to take another example, very interesting because not all of its countries have the same periodization. Just to take one, Argentina, it doesn't have its major neoliberal turn until long after transition. And as you may know, there was a big response to neoliberalism in Latin American history, of which we've not seen its like elsewhere in the world. And if that were not enough, we'd have to solve this problem not just in a series of national settings, but obviously on the terrain of global governance, notably at these international financial institutions, old like the World Bank or new like the World Trade Organization, that have allowed wealthy elites to press a neoliberal agenda so powerfully, as you know. Just to sum up, let's pretend we could conduct all of that geographical work across the 50-year timeline persuasively. I think we could conclude, whatever else we believe, that we can make sense of the fact that human rights fit in the distributional world in which we're living, which is so different than that of the 19th century or the mid-20th. It seems as if we're going to generalize very crudely across the world. What we can say is that our time is one uniquely of massive poverty remediation amidst massive inequality production in most places. Here, China, so-called communist China, establishes the distributional picture of our age, since it has both seen the salvation of so many millions from so-called extreme poverty, according to the World Bank, $1 and something a day, and the production most rapidly of inequality in any society known to history. And many countries, including my own, have seen a similar effect. Fewer poor people, more sufficient provision, alongside greater inequality. So it really is like what Marshall thought could never happen seems the most common picture today, that we have more and more sufficient provision and less inequality. If that's true, I think we can sustain what I would say is a kind of ecological thesis about how human rights relate to our political economy. Socialism, of course, is dead, even when there are parties that in Europe call themselves socialist. And any other form of egalitarian politics died, whether at the national or the global level. There's been massive and surprisingly successful work on social rights, including the use of that idea to stave off austerity campaigns, at least in some cases, in developed welfare states. And human rights has been part of that. But human rights have also been part of a world in which we stop talking about a distributional equality as a major goal, with obvious consequences. It's increasingly disappeared. So I'll conclude by saying that because I believe that at least to some extent I've illustrated the flexibility and salvageability of human rights, while acknowledging that they're conditioned on their political economy, that we can conclude with two lessons. One is that human rights are still important, especially those that are under new threat today. If you want to talk about so-called populism, we can. It's a bad thing when it involves the violation of the most basic rights, and those who want to stand up even for basic civil liberties, let alone any norms of sufficient provision, deserve credit for doing so and support. I don't think any country should decide to build an island to send immigrants or racially others to them, but many are doing so, and anyone who wants to protest it should get credit. However, I think it also means that even if human rights prove salvageable for various kinds of campaigns, including campaigns of sufficient distribution, they're not enough. In particular, they've succeeded in our minds and our action in an unequal world, a world in which equality is less pertinent to us and less, in many countries at least, really experienced. So I'm going to suggest that we put human rights in their place, or put them in a much larger program that transcends sufficient provision to embrace distributive equality. Now, just a last couple of words. You might not be convinced because you feel you need a moral argument against Thomas Paine or others for why equality should have purchase on us. Ultimately, that's a moral claim that requires a philosophical defense. And I'm happy to hear what you think about that. We can also argue instrumentally for equality, even if we're not sure that it has a claim on us. My suggestion here is that part of the reason for so-called populism, not the only one, is that this distributional picture in which the poor may do better, but the rich do a lot better than everyone, is rightly a source of anger. And it's, not surprisingly, misdirected. And those who can tap into it sometimes win elections, especially when they recall that the national welfare state was so exclusionary, and they claim that a fair society needs to be a pure society. So my suggestion is we need to answer them with this larger program and argue that human rights are part of a larger package, not for a minority, not for a set of marginal people in society or to each nation, but also part of a larger package of values that serves majorities, including middle classes. I think that, at least in part, that would have to be an egalitarian program, since most voters for populist have economic and social rights. What they perceive to be happening is that the hard-won egalitarian gains of the past are under threat and the rich are winning. So in conclusion then, let's keep human rights, which have proven to be compatible with every political economy we know, and invent a new political economy in which human rights are preserved as part of a much fairer society than we see unfolding today. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Stan, for a deeply erudite and inspiring talk. It's time for questions, please. Jan, would you like to begin?
Man. So we are recording this so that you know, and I want to use the microphone so that we can get a good recording. And my question goes really to, I think, the heart of the argument you are having with the people in the human rights movement.
Okay.
And on the one hand, you suggested that, in fact, the rise of neoliberalism and the success of these human rights movements was, if I understood it correctly, a sort of parallel play. That, in fact, the success of the neoliberalism didn't really depend on the human rights. That the rise of the human rights was somewhat incidental to the rise of the neoliberalism. Now, I would want to question that a little bit, in that human rights are very much individualistic. They focus on the individual. And it seems to me that in order to have a sort of welfare project, it depends on a sort of collective feeling. That's why they were confined to the national welfare state. That's why it's so difficult to imagine that some sort of welfare can even exist in an organization like the European Union. So we have Wolfgang Streeck, who violently argues against the possibility to have a sort of welfare redistribution in the context of the European Union. So in fact, is it really true that this whole ideological climate, when we focus on individuals, you mentioned also the emphasis on the status recognition, but recognizing different statuses means that we all see that we are also different and we have to recognize the difference. Whereas, to me at least, any sort of redistributive project depends on a sort of collective oppression of individuality for the sake of having this sort of redistribution which can take place in the context of that collective. So then, in fact, the final question we had could be that, do the human rights depend on conditions they not only cannot guarantee, but they may even undermine them incidentally?
Okay. No, that's a terrific question. So I just want to be clear that if you want to get very detailed, I don't want to claim there's no causal connection between human rights and neoliberalism, especially at this kind of mysterious origin point of the 1970s. I think we can say that at a moment of the crisis of socialism, as well as this global egalitarianism that the southern countries are pressing, and which neoliberalism, we now know, I think Quinn Slobodian spoke here some time ago, we now know that neoliberals were most angry about the new international economic order because they really saw the globe as the terrain for neoliberal governance. Maybe it's true that there were certain groups that joined in the human rights movement in the 1970s that joined in a kind of parallel stigmatization of socialism as an idea and of the post-colonial countries as nests of misrule. Even then, it was the criticisms were for different reasons. Maybe we think that there's kind of an economy of idealism, and that to the extent human rights became romanticized, other movements that were more redistributive in their intent lost. But then we have to ask, why did they lose in the first place? Human rights surely didn't cause the collapse of socialism. But really, you're speaking much more about the present and raising, let's say, a version of Marx's thesis that I neglected mainly because I think it's even less plausible. Remember that the central criticism on the Jewish question is that rights are the rights of egoistic man. It's not just that they serve a class, but that they're morally selfish in their structure. And it seems to me your claim, very persuasive, is that welfare states, any kind of distributional fairness depends on some kind of solidarity, building bridges to others, and so forth. So maybe it's the case that the individualization of ethics that human rights involve just isn't compatible with fairness. So I don't think that could be true for a few reasons. First, there were lots of people who they weren't dominant, but they framed the welfare state in terms of economic and social rights, like all the constitutions of the era practically, of the 19 teens teens all the way through the 1940s have these individual social rights. Even if, as I said, in the United Kingdom, just to take one example, the new entitlements aren't framed in terms of rights. Of course, there's still individual entitlements. But last, what could economic equality mean except for a right as an individual to have some modicum of equality with other individuals? It's unintelligible, really, to argue for economic equality, even if we think in terms of class equality. We're talking about classes of individuals. But maybe the hardest version of your question, which I've thought about from time to time because it is interesting, has to do with the individualization of social life in a consumerist time and the difficulty of having the kind of group or national or supranational solidarity on which maybe solidarity has to be based. Now that may be true, but I just don't see what human rights has to do with it. I mean, if we take, consumerism and e-commerce, that has a much more powerful force in individualizing us as subjects than the fact that there's a human rights institute in this country does. Not least since that institute, at least from some historical moment, is making claims about economic and social rights that are about some, maybe limited forms of solidarity. Now, the really interesting question is, not, in my view at least, not about whether human rights can coexist with solidarity, but whether economic fairness is dependent on some relatively exclusionary form of solidarity. So the European Union is just one level up from the nation state. And, in global terms, it's pretty homogeneous people. They're all Christians with some minorities. They all have rough levels of, civilization and wealth. There's no abstract reason that we couldn't imagine the transfer of solidarity from the nation to the region. It's just that it wasn't pursued. And that's because the European Union emerged as a neoliberal project rather than as a social democratic project. But I don't think that you could easily imagine a regional or even global setting in which you have the idea of basic entitlements as rights, and you have some form of solidarity, which was achieved by a political movement. It's just that we haven't figured out how to do it yet. The main reason I want to be skeptical about it is that it seems very fatalistic to say that, solidarity depends on exclusion. If that's true, it's a very sad lesson about our ethics and our capacities. And it doesn't seem completely true to the history I know. Of course, it's absolutely accurate that Adolf Hitler was a great welfare politician who sponsored a lot of solidarity, at least once some of the bad people were excluded. But there's no reason to believe that that kind of exclusionary project, or the one today where you ship people to an island, should define what it means to be German or Danish. And we ought to figure out what are the conditions in which relatively more pluralism fit with some form of solidarity, including economic equality. I'm not saying that's easy to conceptualize, let alone enact. But the point is that if the European Union is neoliberal, it's because someone made it that way, not because that regional governance has to be neoliberal.
Okay, a lot of food for thought and more questions. The first one right here.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask about immigration, so somehow you already answered the question in making the point about the connection between an economically fair system and exclusion or solidarity. So especially in Europe, the far-right parties usually typically combine the defense of national welfare with a very anti-immigrant and xenophobic narrative, assuming that there's contradiction or that assuming that immigration is bad for national solidarity and so on. And recently there is this article circulating on the internet called "The Left Case for Borders." So I was just curious about how you would respond to this kind of self-claimed left narratives that there's contradiction or tension between immigration and national welfare or social rights or equality and so on. But somehow you kind of already answered this.
No, obviously that's the burning question. I mean, my sense is that it's not a real problem. Just in the sense that it's rarely, if ever, the case that immigrants threaten the terms of welfare states. So it's often a rhetorical instrument for electoral success, but not a kind of budgetary necessity. After all, most of these countries, let's leave aside certain Eastern European ones, are ones where there's a lot of work to be done, and that's why there were many, many decades of guest worker programs, and there are declining birth rates, and there's a lot of nostalgia, obviously, for a time when allegedly, at least, there was a kind of golden age of welfare in an ethnically or religiously pure population. But it doesn't, I haven't seen much evidence from economists that it's the case that immigrants actually take jobs that that locals would have gotten, or even that immigration drives declines in welfare provision. Unless, of course, the failures of solidarity mean that Europeans choose to degrade the terms of social citizenship because they don't want to share the provision with new kinds of people. So to me, it strikes me as chiefly an imaginative challenge. How do people who don't think that solidarity, it only makes sense in homogeneous circumstances, how do they kind of sell their project and win elections? And that's a tactical issue. So it may be that on strategic and tactical grounds, let's call it the left needs to think more about precisely what kind of nationalism it's going to adopt. Across the North Atlantic, there's a lot of debate about whether the left needs to be nationalist again rather than supranationalist. It may be that that's true, but of course it would be, the argument would be that the nation is a greater space of economic fairness for all, for a pluralistic society in an era when regional and international governance tends to be neoliberal. So I think I mean, my own response is hopeful that since there's no reason to think that solidarity can't go along with pluralism, that the trouble is, let's say, a marketing one in a neoliberal term, that the right turns out to have an easier way of gaining votes through exclusion and stigmatization, but not a better way of actually governing.
All right, next question, just you.
My name is Hans Otto Sanner. I'm from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And thank you very much for a very impressive lecture. I'm I think that this way that you're framing the discussion in terms of neoliberalism, the last part of the presentation, to me it seems like a bit of a simplification. We are struggling at the moment with trends of populism and nationalism, nativism, as you also said. That so in a way, I think neoliberalism had its heyday in the 1980s, and there are other trends which are important at this stage. For instance, and also we are framing much of the discussion on inequality in terms of the 1%, but that's only part of the discussion. It's a simplification in many ways, because you also have the rights of the middle classes in Asia, and maybe even a reduction in economic inequality in Africa. So there are issues that are important, and if we are to address inequality, I think that we need to have a more, let's say, evidence-based and complex discussion on inequality. And I think also that it's maybe not. We need also to better understand the causes of populism. I think that's also important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Those are wonderful questions, and I agree that precision is of great importance. This is not the most precise talk because I was attempting to do a survey of a couple of centuries and the whole world, but that's inadequate, and so but that's not a reason not to have general inquiries. It's a reason to correct them through local study and have a connection between the two. So as I hear it, you've raised two principal responses, both very good ones. The first, I think, is itself not precise, that we've moved on from neoliberalism, which you've quarantined to the 1990s, to populism. But that's not very precise, I might comment, because let's take the populist of my country. What is his main successful policy? Well, it's not excluding foreigners, it's cutting taxes and increasing inequality. Arguably, we can trace many causal connections between neoliberalism, whether defined in the most narrow way so that it captures the views of just a few people in the 1990s, or more broadly, and populism. I do agree that there's no monocausal account of populism, and one of the trouble of these generalizing categories is that each place is distinctive. Race might play very differently in one place, but maybe there are some general features as well. And wherever we do measure inequality more precisely, we certainly can worry in most of them, and in fairness, some West European countries are excluded, and in every region the situation's complex. You find a stagnation for the middle class, some gains on the part of the poor, and the greatest benefits reaped by the rich. So I'm all for looking at the whole distributional curve, not just the 1%, but that is the whole distributional curve. We have other ways of measuring inequality, like the Gini, which are about the whole distributional curve, but it sort of depends on what we're interested in. There's no reason to neglect the gains reaped by the 1% out of interest in the whole distributional curve, since that fact often tells us about the whole distributional curve. So then I pivot to your second I think, very hard and interesting claim about the relation between national inequality and its history and global inequality and its history. Now, it's very important to note that not only had global inequality increased in the several centuries of colonialism, but at the height of these welfare states for which populists are nostalgic from the 1940s to the 1970s, even though decolonization took place, inequality globally continued to increase. And it was a source of rage. And parts of my book are about how some people in the global South demanded finally that the world reverse global inequality, while others said to give up and to focus on sufficient provision, known as basic needs or economic and social rights. There are arguments, and Branko Milanovic is the most famous, person in making these kind of claims, that no matter the inequality gains we see at the national level, the global terrain suggests modest gains in equality. Now, I wouldn't get too enthusiastic because the gains are modest and they're highly localized. I don't think they're as prominent in Africa as in India and China. But I think the main response is that it's not as if national inequality is not regionally and globally organized. So it would be a mistake to just tout global gains and inequality as if the national reversals did not matter and were not organized by some of the same regional and global institutions, and that we might want to credit for some reduction in global inequality. There's no conceptual reason why we can't imagine greater global equality with stable national inequality. Only neoliberals would claim otherwise when they say that it's just required for the wealthy to win to create more global fairness. So I think, the promise of the welfare state and that welfare world idea I mentioned is that it really wanted to work with equality as an imperative at all the levels of political organization, both national and global, and not choose one at the expense of the other, which has been our choice in our time.
A few more questions, Sam. And the
Sure.
next one,
thank you very much for a very interesting talk. My comment concerns your concept of political economy and how that relates to human rights.
Okay.
So I was a little bit unsure about, so when you talk about neoliberalism as political economy, so neoliberalism, you might say, is also a set of ideas. And so my question is here, so you say you don't go all the way with Marx, you agree with some things, you agree with that political economy matters for our ideas or for human rights, but I'm a little bit unsure here if it's one set of ideas affecting another set of ideas, or if it's ideas about the economy that affects other ideas that are not about the economy, and it seems a little bit hard to disentangle this, and especially to think about this in causal terms, if it is relationship between ideas.
That's a great comment, and it's totally fair. So just as a prefatory comment, of course it's true that neoliberalism has been studied, maybe primarily been studied as a set of ideas, Friedrich Hayek et al. So we have very good intellectual histories of it. Others in the spirit of Michel Foucault and so forth want to study it as a way of life or a subject formation. I think those are both exciting, but in the end, it seems as if we should be interested in it for the new shape of production, distribution, and exchange that it creates. So I use the term political economy to capture that. If ideas helped create it, that's very important to show, but maybe there are other factors. So what I think you've revealed, and it's very helpful, is that I haven't set out my own theory of political economy in general or neoliberalism in particular. What I've tried to do is ask, what is the relation between what I've studied, which is human rights, and that evolving political economy? Now, ultimately, one would want to know, where did the 19th century capitalism, so-called, that Karl Marx witnessed come from? What are its causal origins? Was it somebody's idea or a group of people? Or is there a material history that accounts for it? And same with the welfare state, and same with neoliberalism. I don't know how to give a theory of those things, but we know that they happened. And so my inquiry is much more, let's say, superficial. It says, given that they happen, can we detect first a causal influence of political economy on human rights? And I'm claiming that we can. And then we might ask, well, is there a causal relationship the other way? Do we think that 19th century capitalism emerged because the French Revolution happened? Probably. That was the old view about the French Revolution. But does the fact that bourgeois interests were represented as rights in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, is that causally responsible for the victory of capitalism? That seems implausible. And I'm making the same argument about neoliberalism. So my causal arguments are not comprehensive. They're taking for granted that somehow these regimes of political economy came about. And then I'm asking the more narrow question, which are really, let's say, about not the origins of the base, but you might argue the relationship between the base and the superstructure in Marxist terms.
Yeah, I want to.
Is it on? Yeah. I just want to jump in myself on this one here, this question, because as I mentioned to you, we had this study group yesterday where one of the questions that came up was actually what the relation to neoliberalism was, and it seems to me that to connect those two things, you do two things. The first one is to explore whether human rights pursued economic rights, and then this is a methodological question, then you also to some extent compare, let's say, ideologies, if we name them broadly, ideologies of neoliberalism and human rights. But I think we would like to push just a little bit further along these lines, because you don't say much about the interaction between the two of them. And I guess you can see from two angles. First you can see it from the neoliberal perspective. We talked a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So maybe you could say more about how neoliberal organization, I think, has acted related to human rights. Did they go, you have Hayek, but if we take it broader, did it go unnoticed? Did they fight against it? Did they appropriate it? Did they redefine it? Did they use it? I just looked up an earlier neoliberal experiment in Chile, and that is, of course, the German order liberals, the social market economy.
Sure.
And there you have Ludwig Erhard in the early 50s saying that it's a basic human right to have free consumption and occupation. That's early, of course, but there you see an attempt to take up, use, appropriate, redefine human rights. So that's on the one side.
Yeah.
And then I'm also thinking about the other side, and that is from human rights. The question is, if we want to connect these two things, if we want to go a bit broader, if we want to say something about, here comes another vague concept like populism, neoliberalism, and then zeitgeist. If you read, let's say, Daniel Rogers' The Age of Fracture, I think that's a very good book who shows how belief in collectivism and big institutions, the states and so on, everything dissolves, and then individualism, creativism comes up and all these things, and market metaphors to interpret society. That's a broader context. You don't really go into that, I think, and one could also go a little bit further than the footnote you have on Foucault and individualism by taking the literature on the new spirit of capitalism.
Yes.
If I remember correctly, this famous chapter on French labor unions, they no longer go for economic rights, social rights, they go for rights of creativity and individualism. So maybe somehow if we want to annoy the human rights people a little bit more, there is a contribution, it's just a little bit broader. So maybe you can say a little bit about the interaction between the two.
Great. No, that's a terrific question, and it's really two-sided. And I acknowledge the point, and maybe just let me explore how far it goes, or how far we can prove that it goes. So, of course, it's true that certain neoliberals have tried to revive 19th century rights-based classical liberalism. And in fact, in The Road to Serfdom, Friedrich Hayek says that the language of rights must serve us because it's precisely a language that insists on limits of state power in the name of freedom of contract and private property. Interestingly, when he looks at the planning ideology, which is his main opponent in that book, and the national welfare state more generally, I think he captures something very true. He says there are certain people who are trying to redefine rights to include economic and social rights. But in fact, the successful welfare states are successful because, as Jan might have predicted, they talk less about rights than duties to the collective. But again, those are individual duties. So, and yet, in the long run, I'm just not sure we can say that rights have been a major neoliberal agenda. As I mentioned in the book, in the 70s, when the new human rights movement is created, Hayek says we need to oppose the consequence of this rights agenda for Chile. We shouldn't mess with Augusto Pinochet because he's institutionalizing neoliberalism, and now human rights is about stigmatizing him for the disappearances and so forth. More generally, I think we can say neoliberals, as again Slobodian shows, abandon traditional forms of global governance like the United Nations, where whatever its importance otherwise, as Stephen has shown, it does become a forum for talking about human rights, including economic and social rights and other things on the part of the post-colonial states. And instead, neoliberals rely really on these old and new international financial institutions, and the invention out of really ex nihilo of international economic law, which is now broadly taught. And all of those are attempts to circumvent the United Nations and the post-colonial projects in it. So I think it has to be the case that we acknowledge that there has been a limited extent to which neoliberals themselves have broadly affected the notion and practice of human rights. Now, conversely, I think it's a much tougher question. I don't think it's fair to say, if you ask these two gentlemen who are at the Institute, are you actually shills for capitalism or neoliberal capitalism? Is that what you're doing in the building every day, and preparing these reports? I believe they would say no. And so if it's happening anyway, I think we have to, figure out what we're talking about. It is much more promising, again, to think about neoliberalism as a culture or a mode of subjectivity. But then, if that's true, one's really exempting human rights law and activism from scrutiny. One's really saying that our more popular way of experiencing the world and making ethical claims got transformed, but that doesn't tell us that human rights institutions like this institute or law or are really implicated. It might suggest that they're the wrong thing to look at, and that if we're interested in neoliberal ethics, we need to look at the new spirit of capitalism and the way people live their lives. I think that human rights remain important, and that they're one of the spiritual hallmarks of our time. And that the fact that a country like Denmark can have gone so far in adopting human rights governance, while it's still a minor fact, it's still very significant. And so it seems like we would want that to figure in our understanding, not just of human rights, but of our whole moral situation. And as I've said, it's very important, I think, to many of us that human rights allowed us to globalize our sense of responsibility and even to pursue sufficient provision globally. So my basic response to your question is that while there's a lot of reason to think we should look for more incriminating evidence about the connection, in the end, I want to suggest that it won't in the end lead us to some idea that there's a collusion or conspiracy, which means to me that we can preserve the good things, although modest, that human rights culture has brought us, and preserve it as part of some much more ambitious and bigger ethical program.
I think there's 2 questions left. You could take them together and then you can...
Okay.
Yeah. So there's one at the right here.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Frank Olsen. I'm an external lecturer at the Department of Political Science. I noticed an absence in your book and in your talk today, even though it's an old tradition of political thought that deals primarily with social inequality and that posits itself against liberalism and neoliberalism. And the tradition is republicanism. I was wondering why, I mean, you mentioned some authors like Thomas Paine and in the book James Harrington, who are important figures of republicanism. I was wondering why you do not mention republicanism. I'm assuming perhaps because you focus on the history of human rights and social rights in this book. And secondly, if you would consider republicanism as this broader political program that would encompass social rights and equality.
You want to go?
Yeah, maybe I'll just do it in succession because then it's easier because I'm sure he's not going to ask about republicanism, which is a very interesting tradition. So I think, you know, a long answer would have to involve a lot of detail because one difficulty is that historically and today we have to get clear what we mean. I venture to say that insofar as I intersected in the book, it's to talk about ancient and 18th century versions of republicanism, mainly to make the point that the typical Republican concern when it came to distribution was with regime stability, not justice. And so even someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I think, is very clear that the reason why we are concerned about extremes of poverty and wealth is that it will lead to the collapse of the republic. There's not some first order commitment, at least in the versions of ancient and early modern republicanism that I know about, to economic equality. Now there could be a Republican defense of lots of things, including more economic equality that wouldn't have that instrumental view about why it matters. I don't think, I mean, we could debate how the incidence of the Republican tradition in modern history. I'm not always persuaded by claims that Republicanism, say, lay behind the welfare state just because it was a project of the common good and so forth. We could have a broad theory of republicanism as non-domination, Philip Pettit and so forth, and then claim that non-domination is incompatible with economic inequality, I grant. I'm just not sure that we've seen that connection very strongly in actual history. Socialists were not usually Republicans in the way they frame their thinking. There have been some you probably know, there have been some recent claims that Karl Marx can't be understood except as a product of the Republican tradition, but that's debatable. So as I said, a lot depends for modern and contemporary republicanism, how we define it, who's included. In the end, all I care about for the book's framing is that there be some first order commitment to economic equality. And if that's present in your version of republicanism, then I think you fit in the framework of the book, but it's just not clear that you are.
And then just behind you, Jan. There, yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a very rich and also very important lecture. Now, you've mentioned in some of your earlier works how you, I think, very persuasively have pointed out that human rights is a historical concept. And that also means that there are some things within these rights that are to be negotiated and also to have that they can have a different content at different times. And in addition, you also today touched upon this issue of maybe putting human rights on their right spot, maybe limiting them in some ways. And it made me think of two very concrete, tangible episodes in the Danish history. One was in 1945, in the summer of 1945, after the liberation of the totalitarian Nazi occupation. There was this debate about democracy, where they debated whether it should be a liberal democracy or an economic democracy. The economic democracy, of course, being what they developed in the DDR. And one of the questions there was actually, what could the role of human rights be in an economic democracy? And well, it ended up, of course, with that that there was a majority that was in favor of a more liberal democratic. But the other, where the human rights was somewhat maybe lost, or you could say, was regards to inheritance law. One of the, I'm not an economic historian, as you know, but some of my colleagues have told me that one of the cornerstones of the democratic or of the welfare state in this country is actually that we had some very harsh inheritance tax. And that has really evened out the property between people. Now, people argue that that is actually a violation of the right of property. So there seems to be or is there a dilemma in a way between rights and solidarity? Not that is, but that's just, could you maybe elaborate on the possibility of negotiating the human rights to have a different content, or, yeah.
Good, no, that's fantastic. So, I mean, as a historian, I assume that that all things human are open to contestation and negotiation. And if we're interested in what the right answer of how to define the thing is, we have to, have an argument first. Now, one interesting thing is that makes it very difficult to study human rights, because many of those who are invested in them and are paid by, Denmark to defend them, in the case of my two friends here, they're going to insist that they're set in stone. That if you look at some document, it's authoritative and everyone already agreed what they mean. But of course, that's false. There's persisting contestation and negotiation always. And, the Universal Declaration is not sacred. It's just a snapshot about what some people could agree about at one point. Consider, in 1948, there were only 58 countries. And now there are, 192 or whatever the number is now. So I just assume that we should unsurprisingly find that what people decide are the content of rights will reflect, someone winning and someone losing at any particular point. And my story was about that. So your inheritance story is about how in the middle of the 20th century, some people decided that the right to private property wasn't a real right anymore. It had been the best defended one in world history, and it still is. And of course, intergenerational wealth transfer is the chief, reason why there's so much hierarchy in the world to this day. But it's open to us to say, our ancestors were incorrect. There's no right to what you earn. I mean, that's very radical, but it seems correct philosophically. There's no right, even if you have a right to what you earn, to give it to some other people just because they sprung from your loins. Why? There's no moral argument. So the welfare state was based on the idea that we all in this, still exclusionary group have a claim to everything that any individual produces. And there was no way to cite the right to private property against it. Now, this raises a big question. I mean, are all rights equally open to negotiation and contestation? Well, of course they are in the end. But what I've tried to claim is that there may be some with which we've had a long enough experience that we want to preserve them and immunize them for the sake of inclusion in some future moral bases for consensus. So to me, it seems plausible to think that the right to free speech or the right to basic housing ought to be retained for a new egalitarian politics. And there's no reason to abandon them in the name of an egalitarian politics. It seems like we'd want to insist that they're both compatible in a way the right to private property is not with economic fairness. But of course, time will tell. But those are great questions, and thanks for coming.
Yeah, okay, on that positive and constructive note, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions and the discussion.